Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here at the National Book Festival and at this session with Jeffrey Cohen and the book Belonging. I'm Crosby Kemper. I'm the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the largest cultural agency of the federal government, supporter of libraries and museums. Jeffrey Cohen is professor of psychology at Stanford University and holds the august and complicated title of the March Professor of Organizational Studies in Education and Business. The book, of course, is Belonging, the Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides, which sounds like the perfect book for our time because we are all in the midst of bridging these divides. But we already have a belonging problem. We don't belong to the technology yet. Here, Jeffrey, what leads a boy from New Jersey who became a professor at Stanford to be interested in the subject of belonging? What did you belong to as a kid that was important to you?
Well, for sure my family and my friendship group. And I think I, as a shy kid growing up in New Jersey, didn't really feel like I belonged very much, especially in those hard teenage years. I felt very much like an outsider, and so being an outsider, you kind of start to wonder, well, what does it take to be on the inside? Is it something about what you wear, something about how you talk, and maybe playing sports? None of that worked for me. And so I was just kind of enduringly curious about, well, what does it mean to belong? Who is cast as an insider, who is cast as an outsider? And that led to a lot of my longstanding curiosity in this topic.
So this has been something you've been thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of think about it.
Okay, well, and so we all think about it. Have you decided that you do belong? I mean, you're a star at the National Book Festival.
Oh wow!
Have you finally made it to insiderdom?
Well, no.
And do any of us ever think we're really on the inside?
Well, it's a very good question. I think as a social psychologist, these are great questions. As a social psychologist, what I'm so intrigued by is how situational our feeling of belonging is. I have just been struck in my life how I can feel like I belong and feel very confident in myself with one group, say my friends back home in New Jersey, but then being at a novel environment where people don't know me, I feel like a stranger in a strange land. All of a sudden, I feel that confidence slipping out from under my feet. So that's actually one of the enduring lessons of social psychology, is that a lot of that sense of belonging isn't so much a trait, but it's a state that's situated. And the situations that we create for one another and for ourselves can have a huge impact on that sense.
So in some ways, what you're saying is this is a human situation. It's our predicament as human beings that we all share. We all share this feeling that we don't always belong, that we're not always on the inside. At the same time, you make something in the title of the book and in the book itself that this is a very important moment to understand belonging, because we are so divided in this country. I mean, we all belong to either the red team or the blue team. So we all belong to a team, or if you're at working for the Library of Congress today, you're in the purple team, which is, I guess, in the middle. But we all have our teams, so belonging in one sense doesn't seem like a problem. We're all belonging.
Yeah.
It's the way we belong that seems to be a problem.
Absolutely. I think what's consistent is what psychologists call that need to belong, which in the 20th century, people like John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, developmental psychologists realized was so important in the early years, forming that attachment. And a lot of the practices that we have today that we take for granted, like letting a newborn be held by its mother, came out of that research on the importance of early bonds. I think the lesson of the 21st century is that need for attachment continues throughout the lifespan. And we have it throughout the lifespan, from the cradle to the grave. As a social species, we need to be with other people. We need to have that sense of being together. It is like that opposite of loneliness, which is a devastating psychological condition, severe loneliness. The opposite of loneliness is that sense of belonging to something bigger than you, a group. And so I think it's a need to belong that can be channeled one way or another. It's not intrinsically a good thing, or a bad thing. That need to belong, if it's defeated, can make people, for instance, vulnerable to extremist groups that promise a sense or a source of belonging if you subscribe to these malevolent beliefs. It makes us vulnerable. And so that's why it's important for us to all be aware of how important that need to belong is and what we can do as a society, but also down on the ground in our daily encounters to nurture it in one another.
And a lot of what the book is about, and a lot of the messages that I think are really great messages from the book, are about how we do this, our belonging, the process that we go through in certain circumstances. One of your mentors was a guy named Kurt Lewin, who escaped from Germany in the 30s, and he was, of course, interested in why the Nazis could develop such a sense of belonging among the German people. And talk a little bit about him and the notion of the participatory and democratic ideas that he had about belonging.
Yeah, Kurt Lewin, one of my goals is to resuscitate this name of Kurt Lewin, who is just so important in the history of social sciences. It's really hard to underestimate his impact. He, as you said, was a German refugee fleeing the Nazis. And his big insight was that a lot of the problems that we see in a society, such as authoritarianism, he was very interested in how these authoritarian regimes came to be and got ordinary civilians to do their dirty work, whereas in the past it had been like the elites. So how does this happen? And a lot of the philosophy and the thinking at the time was that it had something to do with an authoritarian personality, that people somehow are socialized to be vulnerable to authoritarian appeals. The German culture was very, very civilized. It was a democratic culture. The Nazis were democratically elected. What made them vulnerable? Lewin said, no, it's not some intrinsic feature of their character. It is the situation, and particularly the Nazis' ability to recast German society and the situation of daily life through propaganda, youth groups that began at age 6, to inculcate in people a sense of allegiance to a doctrine. And so Lewin would do these experiments. The second thing that he did that was very important was to show what could be if we just change things a little bit. And he would bring in people, for instance, boys and boys clubs, and have them work under an authoritarian leader who was kind of command and control, or a democratic leader who was help the boys to identify their collective will and figure out a plan to act on it. What he found is that that kind of leadership style, these leadership styles, transformed the culture of these boys clubs and the behavior of the boys, such that under authoritarian leadership, the boys would scapegoat each other, get into a lot of fights. They were in this kind of self-preservation mode. It's just me and I got to protect myself. Whereas for the democratic leaders, the boys were engaged with one another. They saw one another as affirmations, sources of delight rather than threat. This was a sign of how something powerful in our situation, a leader, can shape our being, the way we act, the way our sense of self and our relationships with other people. And he went on to do this with adults, just showing, in spite of massive cultural currents, we can create alternative situations that open up a crack that lets our full potential come out as, in this case, more collegial citizens.
And the other person I wanted you to talk a little bit about, who was a big influence on you, specific direct mentor to you, is Claude Steele. It's a very different kind of look at the world from him than Kurt Lewin's. So there's somehow these very different building blocks to where you've landed. And he wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi. And I'm a fan of that book, as I am of yours. And tell the story, the actual beginning story, the story that the title is about, that's so important to Claude Steele.
Well, Claude, my mentor, draws on a story from Brent Staples, the New York Times member of the editorial team and journalist, writer. Brent Staples noticed that as a black man walking about, I think it was New York City, that people would be tense and they would cross the street when they saw him coming. And so his race and and what race means in America created this situation for him where other people avoided him in the neighborhood, walking down the streets. What he realized is that he could switch the situation by whistling Vivaldi, whistling a piece from Vivaldi. And then he says he could see the tension drain from people's face as he passed. People would smile at him as he passed, and the situation was diffused. It's a story that shows how much stereotypes affect our day-to-day interactions and our perceptions of one another, and what we can do, in this case as the individual, to change the situation at least a little bit to make it more comfortable for ourselves. I don't think it's, of course, not the individual's entire responsibility, but the importance of perception, how we perceive situations, is the key lesson here. Lewin was talking about the power of groups, power of situations. What Claude and others are talking about is the power of perception, how we see the situation. Situations are experienced not just in front of our eyes, but behind our eyes. We make sense of them. And and what I'm so excited about sharing is just all the great research and tools for shifting perceptions and situations for the better.
And so let's talk a little bit about the research that you've done and the research that you talk about in the book. There's an interesting law school student experiment in which they take black and white students, all of whom feel some anxiety about law school. I have a daughter who's in law school waiting for me to have dinner tonight. And she has lots of anxiety, I can tell you. Not about having dinner with me, but talk about that experiment and what you did, what happened to these law students.
Yeah, well, that was a little intervention, let's call it intervention. I don't quite like that term, but an experience that was created by another social psychologist, Greg Walton, and myself, wherein what we did was to share stories with freshman students at college that made clear two things. And these stories came from upperclassmen. The stories made clear first that everyone, when they go through this difficult transition into college or into law school, graduate school, everyone at some time or another feels like they don't belong. It's normal. You are not alone in your misery. That's a really important message for people to hear, that you're normal. We all feel like we're faking it until we make it. The second message was that with strategy and reaching out, things can get better. And these were just conveyed through stories, the power of stories. Candace Millard talked about how last night literature makes you understand you're not alone. That's what we were exploiting here, leveraging stories to open people up to an understanding that their isolation was not something unique to them or to their group, their racial group, their gender group. And what we found is that this had huge effects on students' GPA over their next 4 years in college. And in some work by Shannon Brady, who tracked down these students years and years later, as a result of this sharing of stories, which took about an hour or so, these students then went on after graduation to have more satisfying careers, to be happier, to be more civically involved. So a little shift in your filter at a key transition can have a big effect. And I think that's one of the lessons. The book really is not a call for system change. Of course, we need to work on our institutions and our laws. That is paramount. But in addition, we need to work with the raw materials of the situation at hand. And there are many things we can do right here, right now, as educators, as managers, as parents, as friends, to make situations so much better than they are.
You said a little bit earlier that you didn't like the word intervention, but on the other hand, you have this phrase that you use fairly regularly in the book, and a lot of the various studies and experiments that you talk about, you call wise interventions. Yeah. And I like the word wise there. And I think you describe a number of wise interventions, but why don't you like the intervention word?
Well, I'm not entirely against it. I think it's a word that people understand, which is helpful. But the problem is that And intervention applies that I'm doing something to you. I'm kind of intervening on you as an outsider. And I think what all these interventions, so-called interventions, do is instead they lift barriers. They support people. They're more like acts of support that lift the barriers, like my sense of not belonging, my uncertainty about belonging, my concerns about being stereotyped. They lift these powerful restraints on our potential so that who we are and what we know can show itself more fully. So I kind of see them more as catalysts. They unlock what's already there in us.
And a lot of the research that you talk about, it deals with the various biases, the stereotypes that we all have, and we've all heard the term implicit bias these days. And yet there's also a lot of challenge in the social science community to some of the studies of implicit bias, because there's so many different, we've both been reading Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, and he goes through a whole list of biases, availability bias, confirmation bias, et cetera, that we all have, and it's not just racial bias or sexist bias, but the biases of our situation. And you talk about another phrase that you use over and over again that is fascinating in the context of the book is situation crafting. In which you describe some of these experiments that as crafting a situation so that people's biases can be revealed to them or moderated through the situation.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what the meaning of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Implicit bias is simply a manifestation of something more general, which is that our minds play tricks on us. We often think we're being objective when we're really not. And that can be incredibly damaging in the domains of the fault lines that are racking our country: racial, gender, class. One of the things that we found, and a lot of people have found, is that our minds engage in this kind of mental gymnastics to justify or rationalize. This goes back to subjective videos, classic research. Our minds rationalize our decisions so that we feel like we're being objective even when we're really not. One example, for instance, is that people will redefine the criteria for what it means to be good at a job to fit the candidate's credentials that they want to hire. So if the candidate for police chief happens to have a lot of administrative skills, people say, oh, you know what's really important for being police chief is having a lot of administrative skills. If they have a lot of street smarts, people say, oh, they have street smarts are really important for this job. They do that rationalization more for men than for women. And as a result, the people who feel like they're making the most objective decisions are actually making the most biased ones. They feel like I'm picking the right man for the job, when in fact, they're picking the right criteria for the man. So how do you deal with that? You can do this kind of what we call situation crafting, where you change what Thaler and Kahneman and Sunstein called the decision architecture. For instance, commit to your job criteria in advance. Put them down in writing. And that little strategy of commitment to criteria eliminates gender discrimination, at least in the studies that we've done. So that's an example of one way to bypass these biases.
And you quote Richard Feynman a couple of times about this, that the easiest person to fool is yourself.
That's right.
And Cargo Cult Science, his essay, Cargo Cult Science, and that we're all, critical thinking really, it needs to be focused on yourself first.
So well said.
Right.
So well said. Critical thinking isn't so much about being critical of other people, it's about being critical of your own mind. And I saw this on a bumper sticker, which actually goes back to Taoism. Don't believe everything you think.
And so in our world right now, the big sort that we're all into, in which we only talk to people who are like us, and there's the red team and there's the blue team, and some of us eke into the purple team every once in a while. But the tribalism that we're experiencing, how do we shine that light in the red team, blue team universe?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because it's such a big issue. It's going to be hard. I don't have all the answers here at all, but I do review a lot of the research that gives hope. And there's some wonderful, wonderful research out there. I'll give you two examples. The first by David Brookman and Josh Okala, where all they do is they have these 10-minute conversations across the political aisle. I'll make a long story short. They go into one of the most conservative areas of Florida, I think it's Miami-Dade, and the canvassers knock on the voter's door and they have a discussion about transgender rights for 10 minutes. And as a result of this conversation, they create enduring changes in people's support for the rights of transgender people that are evident months later. And these individuals will even stand up against hate propaganda against transgender people. So what happens in those 10-minute conversations? First, what's important is what does not happen. The canvasser does not bombard the resident with arguments and rhetoric. They ask questions. What do you think about this issue? They empower. As a voter, you have a chance to make a big impact on this issue. And they listen. Let's talk about this. Those sorts of civil conversations are so important for democracy. I love the term conversation. Conversation, the etymology means to turn over and over together. You're turning an issue over together. That's what a conversation is. And they can be transformative. These two fellows do something else in the context of these conversations, not so simple. One other thing is they create empathy. But they create empathy through analogical situations. They ask the voter, have you ever experienced the pain of feeling like you were treated unfairly because of something about you? What was that like? And the voters will mention things. One guy from an Iraqi, a veteran from the Iraq War, describes how he has PTSD and can't get a job because of he has PTSD. And that experience opened him up to the pain of exclusion that transgender people feel. So at this higher emotional level, we're very similar in terms of our feelings and need to belong and to connect, and that's what they're tapping into. Through these and other steps, they create meaningful change. The second example I'll just give you of something that we can do all in our day-to-day lives is how we talk about our opinions. Michael Schwabe, a postdoc at Stanford University, did these great studies just showing that when you give your opinion, say, I think. I think, from my point of view. And it turns out that that dramatically opens people up to the other side, making room for the possibility that there are other points of view here. My view isn't the only view. And it, in fact, also makes the person doing the talking more open to considering alternatives in a very enduring way. So that's just one thing we can do, is stop talking to people like little authoritarians, where my way is the right way. If you disagree, you must be biased. I think this, from my perspective, I'm trying to work this out. Let me push back on that a little bit. Having those kinds of discourses can be really transformative, but it's a skill set.
It's a skill set, and our whole, the structure of the national conversation, if you will, is completely different. It's fueled by social media, which is an endless series of individual short statements, apodictic statements, to the most extreme extent possible, because that's how you get the most people looking at what you're doing online and social media. So, I mean, it seems to me the great lesson of the book is the notion of conversation, and that the conversation has to be dialogic. It has to be, there need to be questions asked,
Yeah.
and answers, and the answers need to be listened to. It needs to be clear that you as an individual, that me as an individual, I have to be listening to you.
Yeah, that's right. I have to listen.
But that's almost a secret sauce. Once you start doing that.
Well, it's not easy, though. It's not easy for two reasons. One is of confirmation bias, right? We kind of have this pervasive tendency to really like information that confirms our prior beliefs and resist information that disconfirms it. So that's one barrier to listening that if we're aware of, we can adjust for. The second challenge is to ask good questions. Knowing what we don't know turns out to be very hard. And so asking questions that are genuinely motivated by curiosity. I really want to understand your perspective, rather than questions motivated to put the other person on the defensive or to confirm our beliefs about the other side. That is a skill set too that I go into.
And there are words, and you've used at least one of these words, well, to both of these words already, that seem to me a part of the secret sauce, and which again is sort of absent from our dialogue, and I mean this both left and right, and frequently even in the center, which is humility. You need a certain amount of humility in the conversation to achieve empathy, and empathy is important. You've used both those words, and ultimately to achieve some form of communication that we can both agree on.
Yeah.
But there has to be something where you let the other person know that you might not know. Telling you, I don't think I know everything. I've learned something from your book. I've learned a lot of things from your book. Just by saying that, I've admitted something, and I've given you an opportunity to tell me some more.
Yeah, I love that. It's like that Sir Isaac Newton quote. It's actually a paraphrase of another quote. What we know is a drop. What we don't know is an ocean.
Right.
And I think that is true. And the universe is very mysterious, and having that understanding is the first step. My colleague Lee Ross, who recently passed away, has coined what he called the objectivity illusion, which is our tendency to think that what our minds deliver to us in terms of beliefs and attitudes are an objective reflection of what's out there, rather than what they really are, a construction of our minds and thus susceptible to biases. And so he shows, and others show, that if you can kind of shake that belief a little bit, just have people understand that their minds are not fully to be trusted. And we've talked about those illusions that show that, visual illusions where you don't see the person in the gorilla suit passing through a group of people passing a basketball because you're not looking for it. Understanding that our minds can play tricks on us is one of the first strategies to creating that humility. I think one of the themes that I like is that social psychology addresses is that a lot of these virtues, such as humility, empathy, are not so much virtues. I mean, we all want, maybe not all, but we do value humility. We do value, as you've said, the golden rule. But a lot of these virtues are also strategies. There's a how-to, a skill set for really doing it.
And so a lot of the individual studies that you talk about have got this process engaged where you set people up to do something, you engage in a conversation, and you demonstrate these things, but it's not happening in our daily lives. So how do you transcend the barrier of the experimental group of the social, and it's of course one of the things that Daniel Kahneman has talked about this lately. He talks about it in Noises and in some of the conversations you can see online, that the problem of replicability of social psychology experiments, and part of the problem is simply you as a researcher, or Walton, or there's I'd love to talk about Elizabeth
Pollock,
her experiment with the Rwandans. But it takes somebody pretty extraordinary to actually get people to come together and do these things, and we're not doing it in general in our public life. How can we transcend the barrier of the laboratory, if you will, and into the real world?
Yeah.
Of course, she did it in Rwanda.
She did it in Rwanda.
So maybe that's a good one to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. She did so this is Betsy Pollock. She did an amazing study in Rwanda where they were trying to bridge the trust gap between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And what better way, or one way to do this, was through a soap opera, a sort of Romeo and Juliet soap opera about two star-struck lovers from villages in conflict who managed to fall in love and bring their villages together. And it's a series of episodes in a soap opera told over, I think, 8 occasions. And it's just a little radio show. And like all stories, like books, what it does is provide a realistic vision of hope. It doesn't deny the problems of conflict that exist between the villages or between the two groups, but it provides a sense of possibility. This is how we could be. And the stories emphasize the little moments of connection between the villages that bring people together. And what she finds is that after listening to this soap opera relative to a control group, people are more open to intermarriage between groups. They're more open to trust. Their norms, their beliefs about what could be and should be shift, just as a result of hearing these stories. So I think the power of stories. Going back to one other thing that you mentioned, I think it's not that difficult, actually. There are some obvious things that have non-obvious power, like saying, I think, being polite. Politeness turns out to be an amazingly powerful intervention, saying, please, thank you. Those are the things that we deprive towards outgroup members in research, it's been shown. But it can be a very powerful thing to just interact with politeness. People become much more respectful of authority, likely to endorse the norms and the beliefs of an institution if they feel that they're treated with respect. There are some obvious things, but there are some not so obvious things. One of the strategies that we've looked at is what's called values affirmations, where we just give people who are feeling like they don't belong the chance to reflect on their core values at these moments of stress. What really matters to you? What gives you a sense of purpose? And we find in a number of different studies, other colleagues have found this in large-scale studies, that that small act of thinking about what's really important to you helps people get through stressful situations and come to feel like they belong in school. In one study, it increased the percentage of African Americans making it to college by 20 raw percentage points, just that small act. I think that what these experiments tell us isn't just the power of an intervention, but they tell us the missed opportunities under the status quo. That little act, giving people a little piece of paper to reflect on their values, has this huge effect. That means that under the status quo, we are missing so many opportunities to unlock people's potential. And as a social psychologist, that's my whole gig, is the power of the situation right here, right now, and the potential that resides in it, and the strategies we can use to tap into it.
And so you used the word affirmation a lot, and this is what you're talking about, the affirmation and relating it to Maslow's hierarchy of values, and it's a sense of purpose, which you relate to a sense of belonging, is so important. I think it's what you just said. But so here's my question, my probing a little bit on this. We've gone through a movement around self-esteem in this country over the last 20 or 30 years, and I think there's been a genuine negative reaction to the every child gets a medal version of that. Yeah. And yet at the same time, reading your book, I absolutely believe what you've just said, which is if you ask somebody what their sense of purpose is all about, they will give you something that you will bond with.
Yeah.
In part because I think, as you said earlier, I believe very strongly, I think you believe that we all ultimately believe at some level, maybe for pragmatic reasons, maybe for transcendent reasons, in the golden rule. We all believe in reciprocity at some level.
Yes, we all believe in reciprocity, and these values are what give us, let's call it self-esteem or self-integrity. I think the self-esteem movement, I think the problem was that it had this very narrow view of self-esteem as coming from flattering and praising people, when really what gives us a sense of self-worth isn't so much being praised. I'll sort of use a Adam Smith quip, but being praiseworthy, being a person who does things and acts on the world in ways that align with their values. And so examples like values affirmations give people the chance to say and assert, this is what I stand for, this is what I would die for. And that's what gives people that sense of integrity, that gives them the fortitude to keep going and to keep trying, even in the face of adversity, even in the face of exclusion. So that is the power of affirmation and how it differs from self-esteem. I think it's really more about being a valued person in the world, someone who can give to the world, that sense of purpose. That's what we were designed to do. There's research in this, in the realm of genomics, showing that down at the level of our genes respond better when we have that sense of eudaimonic well-being, that sense of purpose. I have latched my ego to something bigger than myself. That down at the level of the genes, there's less of an inflammatory response. The genes responsible for triggering inflammation are less likely to be turned on, reducing risk for cardiovascular disease and other viral and viral infection as well. So even at that level, in our biology, it seems encoded in us that we are supposed to connect ourselves with the outside world, with each other, common purpose.
You know, you talk about politeness and as being important. At one point in the book, you talk about a teacher who refers to everybody as Mr. or Ms., the students, and how that gives them the feeling of respect. And you talk about Goffman's notion of the rituals of respect, that the one thing that we all own is our face. Yeah. And the ritual of simply looking someone in the eye, the ritual of simply listening empathetically to someone is transformative.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to show that we value a self is to listen to it, to hear it. And Goffman, my all-time favorite sociologist, saw in these little rituals, he's like, isn't it interesting that every single culture has in it a protocol for politeness? And the rituals seem kind of similar to what we do to honor the sacred. What is the sacred thing that we're honoring when we're being respectful and polite? It's the self, which each of us has. Critiques from Buddhism notwithstanding. Everyone has. And I think it was interesting. I'm reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, where she describes how one of the rigid protocols in Antebellum South was to make sure you do not speak politely to black people, saying sir or ma'am, no. So politeness and the withdrawal of politeness is a way that we signal to others that we see them as fully human or not.
Right. Putting people in their place versus bringing people into your space or coming into theirs as a visitor. So I think at this point we want to open it up to questions from the audience. Polite questions. Certainly challenging questions if you want.
Hello. I'm so deeply inspired by your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What comes up for me is the insurrection and what conversations are needed to transform what happened here. And all this talk of civil war and total chaos in our country. Yeah. What I hear you saying is what we need so desperately. And I just want to know what you think we need to do to really turn this around. Thank you.
Yeah. It's going to be hard. I wrote the book because I think that there are little things we can do in our everyday life to make the situation better. We are fragmented by so many forces: polarization, institutional racism, xenophobia, the list goes on, social media, the mental health crises. Yet, I do believe this, each of us has a little bit of a superpower in our day-to-day encounters to make each other feel a little better, a little more respected. And the research demonstrates this, such as the Brookman and Collis study I mentioned, or saying I think that can have a transformative effect in our day-to-day encounters, and there can be ripple effects. Who knows where that could go? That could be like the ripples from a pebble dropped in a pond. Little things can produce massive change when we all do them. So I'm hoping.
Hi, thank you so much. So I work in organizing, and we utilize a number of things that you've talked about. We do storytelling through one-on-ones. The Berkman and Callis study, deep canvassing, is something that's being tested in all sorts of different practices outside of canvassing. But one of the limitations for that is it requires individuals, it requires capacity, and it requires money. And so the place where organizing is trying to kind of like identify how to have those conversations that allows for more scale and less funding is in the digital space. And so we've seen kind of like organic organizing, like K-pop fans all signing up for Trump rallies and messing up the organization of the like ticketing and things like that. So I guess my question is, I wrote it down because I wasn't sure how to phrase it.
Yeah.
Just like what have you seen as research or theorized from the research that you've seen on like how to effectively translate this to community building through digital media, particularly if the intent's to build community to take collective action?
Yeah, well, I think some places are doing that. Braver Angel, Better Angel, for instance. Yeah,
Better Angels, yeah.
Better Angels.
Yeah.
There are these online groups that are, I participated in one over during the, earlier in the pandemic. And those sorts of online forums can be very useful. I think that also just in our day-to-day lives, we can practice a lot of this stuff. Get out there, talk to people across the political divide, make cross-race friends. Find the situations that help you to be the person you want to be. So I think that like in our own individual lives, there's a lot that can be done. In terms of community organizing, I agree, like more funding of this work would be wonderful. Right now, I don't know if as much is going into it as could be. And one of the big problems, I think, is that some of these things they seem simple, and they are simple, and they seem easy to do, and they are easy to do, but they're also easy to do wrong. So there needs to be more kind of collaboration between researchers and practitioners for making these conversations better structured. Just to take one example, what Kurt Lewin always talked about was people become much more malleable when you talk to them outside of their group. Bring them outside of their group and put them in a new group with new norms, and that's a much more effective vehicle for behavioral change. I don't think that lesson, for instance, that little nuance is applied in many of these programs and discussions. So I would love to see more collaborations between social scientists and practitioners that are well funded to create these mass movements or kind of community level exercises in empathy based on the research.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so
Thanks.
quick question.
I'll try to
My question is much smaller than the last two. Thank you for those two important questions. What are one or two things that you would stress as the most important things that regular, everyday people should do? I
Sure.
think you've probably already said them.
I said, yeah.
Can
yeah.
you just stress the top couple that you would highlight?
Sure. 3. One is using I think, right? Not talking in an authoritarian way. We tend to use that term authoritarian to apply to leaders, but we can all be authoritarian in our day-to-day lives. Humility, right? Talking and in a way and thinking in a way that's humble. That's one thing. The second is these reminders, these psychological timeouts that we can all do for ourselves to kind of clear our heart space and head space. For instance, reminding ourselves of our core values at times of stress or daily, what we have to be grateful for. Very powerful. Reminding ourselves of who we are at a core level. That's the second thing. The third is, in honor of Lee Ross, I would say, fight the fundamental attribution error. Fight the fundamental attribution error. It's the one bit of jargon I used in the book. Fundamental attribution error. That is our tendency, especially in the Western world, to think that everything, all the behavior that we see in the world comes from things inside of people, their character, their ability, their traits. And we fail to understand that so much of behavior arises from the circumstances that people are in. We don't ask questions about what those circumstances are even. So much of people's lives is invisible to us. Fight the fundamental attribution error. It is a human psychological reflex, especially in the Western culture, to think that bad behavior corresponds to some bad essence, when oftentimes the badness exists in circumstances, and if we took the time to understand it better, we might be able to intervene better. So those three things.
We've got 1 minute left. Sir.
Thank you. Thank you. The reason I attended today having to do with Connection was during the first year of the pandemic, I was involved in a voluntary leadership program, and I was interested in loneliness, and I started to do some research in the locality here, Northern Virginia and DC, having loneliness levels of over 40%. One individual, whatever we can extract from that, one person in the census living alone, and I was at that time my father was living alone, and I became very aware of that. How to address this?
Oh, the problem of loneliness. Yeah. Well, there are many answers. Just, there is loneliness is a big problem. Our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, says it's a sort of national crisis that we need to address, because it turns out loneliness is one of the most toxic environmental factors out there, worse than cigarette smoking, worse, I think, than radon, right? Having that sense of being disconnected from the rest of humanity is very, very bad for our psychological and physical well-being. How do we address it? Well, John Cacioppo has a great book on loneliness where he reviews a lot of the interventions and strategies for doing this, but one thing is a sense of purpose, service, as Murthy calls it, committing ourselves to a larger purpose. It turns out that in the research, purpose supersedes the effect of loneliness, so that even lonely people, when they have a sense of purpose, they don't suffer as many of the health costs, health damage that's associated with loneliness. So one of the effects of loneliness seems to be to cut ourselves off from larger projects. So getting people involved, like, I don't know, in the case of this individual that you're talking about, volunteerism turns out to be an amazingly effective strategy for helping people to feel connected, feel that sense of purpose. And there's an increasing amount of research just showing service, giving to others, that act of being pro-social, turns out to be very good for other people, but very good for ourselves and for clawing ourselves out of some of the anguish of loneliness.
So, Sarah, the captain of the purple team, has told me that I have to wrap it up. So I want to thank you, Jeffrey, for the conversation and for the book. And I think we all have a little bit better sense of belonging after this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Crosby.
Yeah.
Thank you.